The jungle was alive, pulsing, breathing, whispering secrets that Alex couldn't decipher. Every step he took through the alien wilderness was heavy with purpose, but tainted with uncertainty. His boots sank slightly into the soft, bioluminescent moss, carpeting the forest floor. The air hung thick with heat, scented by flowers that glowed like molten fireflies in the gloom. Every so often, something in the darkness would stir low growls, distant hisses, and the faint shimmer of movement that reminded him he didn't belong here. Yet, Alex pressed forward. He wasn't on Zerathis to explore or admire its beauty. He was here to survive. The crash of his ship 2 days ago had stranded him on this untamed planet, surrounded by a wilderness that wanted him dead. And the Zerathi hunters, they wanted something worse. "Keep moving," he muttered to himself, wiping the sweat from his brow. The starlight above pierced through the canopies in silver beams, but the darkness was suffocating. His rifle was strapped to his back, useless after running out of plasma charges, and his knife sat snug against his thigh. Then it happened. A sound low, guttural, and dangerous ripped through the silence like a blade through flesh. Alex froze, his every nerve sparking to life. Something was watching him. He could feel its gaze like the kiss of a predator, hidden but poised to strike. Before he could blink, she stepped into the light. The alien woman's entrance was like the unveiling of a storm, graceful, breathtaking, and deadly. Scarlet, leader of the Zerathi hunters, strode toward him with a feline grace that made every hair on his body stand on end. Her blue skin shimmered under the moonlight, a faint ethereal glow highlighting her perfect curves. Her long white hair cascaded like silk down her shoulders, framing a face carved by the gods themselves. But it was her eyes, black and bottomless, that froze Alex in place. They weren't just eyes, they were weapons, sharp and unyielding, yet hinting at something far deeper, something trapped. "Human," she said, her voice a quiet purr that sent shivers down his spine. "You are trespassing." Alex didn't move. He barely breathed. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, the plunging red mini-dress clinging to her like a second skin, the faint glint of her sharpened claws, and the intoxicating confidence she exuded with every word. He'd heard the stories. The Zerathi hunters were not to be trifled with. Scarlet, in particular, was a legend among warriors, a living myth that haunted soldiers across the galaxy. And here she was, standing before him, so close that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. Alex swallowed hard and squared his shoulders. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Meaning doesn't matter here," Scarlet replied, her voice soft but laced with warning. "This world is ours. Humans have no place on Zerathis." She stepped closer, circling him like a predator stalking prey. Her gaze roamed over him, lingering on his face, his chest, and the taut muscles that moved beneath his sweat-soaked shirt. Alex didn't flinch, though his heart thundered in his chest. "Most men tremble when they see me," Scarlet murmured, the edges of her red lips curling into a dangerous smirk. "Why don't you?" "Guess I don't scare easy," Alex replied, his tone low and steady, though every instinct told him to run. Scarlet stopped in front of him, mere inches away. She tilted her head, a curious expression flickering across her face. "Foolish or fearless?" "Maybe both," Alex shot back, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. For the briefest moment, something passed between them, an electric current that neither of them could explain. Scarlet's black eyes locked onto his, and Alex saw it again. The crack in her armor, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. "You're an interesting human," she said quietly, though her claws were already raised, ready to strike. Alex's muscles tensed. If she attacked, he wouldn't stand a chance. But instead of fear, he felt something strange stir within him, an urge to reach out, to understand this beautiful and dangerous creature standing before him. "I'm not here to fight you," he said, his voice softer now. "I didn't choose to come here." Scarlet's claws froze mid-air. She blinked, stunned by his words. No one had ever spoken to her like this without fear or malice, but with something else, something gentler. "And what makes you think I care, human?" "I don't," Alex admitted, "but I think there's more to you than the stories say." Scarlet's expression hardened, but he saw the flicker of doubt behind her eyes. Slowly, she lowered her hand, her claws retracting. The heat of her body lingered between them like a tangible thing, and for the first time in years, Scarlet found herself unsure. Alex's voice broke the silence. "You don't have to be what they expect you to be." Scarlet stepped back as though struck. Her gaze sharpened, a storm swirling in her eyes. You think you know me? No, Alex replied quietly, but maybe I'd like to. For the first time in a lifetime of battles, Scarlet faltered. She turned away, her white hair catching the moonlight, as she whispered something Alex barely heard. You're a fool. And then, before he could say another word, she disappeared into the shadows as silently as she'd come, leaving Alex standing alone under the alien sky. But he knew it wasn't over. Something had shifted between them, and deep down, in the core of his being, Alex felt it. The wild beast had seen something in him, something that intrigued her, and he would find her again, no matter the cost, because he couldn't deny it. He needed her. And maybe, just maybe, she needed him too. Alex moved through the jungle, his senses heightened, his body alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Scarlet was no longer a myth, no longer a whispered ghost among the stars. She was real. She was dangerous, beautiful, and far too close to the edge of something he couldn't quite name. He knew she was watching him. Every shadow, every rustling branch, every distant growl, it was her, or at least he wanted it to be. The memory of their encounter lingered like a brand, heating his skin whenever he thought of the way she'd looked at him. Black eyes, scarlet lips, a body sculpted to tempt even the strongest men into submission. And yet, Alex hadn't felt weak. No, Scarlet's presence had awakened something in him, something primal and unrelenting. And so, when she finally appeared again, stepping out of the darkness with that same predatory grace, Alex wasn't surprised. Back for another round? He asked, his voice low and teasing. Scarlet didn't smile, but there was a glint in her eyes, a spark of curiosity that hadn't been there before. She stood before him, her red dress clinging to her in ways that defied logic, her white hair flowing like liquid silver in the soft light. Why haven't you left? She demanded, her tone clipped and sharp. Where would I go? Alex replied, stepping toward her. I don't exactly have a ship. She watched him, her black eyes narrowing slightly as he closed the distance between them. Unlike before, she didn't move to strike. Instead, she stood her ground, her expression unreadable. You're reckless, she said quietly. And you're hiding, Alex shot back. Her eyes widened just slightly, so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. But Alex saw. He was beginning to understand the cracks in Scarlet's armor, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted to see what was underneath. I'm not hiding, Scarlet replied, her voice low and dangerous. You know nothing of me, human. Then tell me, Alex challenged. Let me see you. Scarlet stepped forward so suddenly that Alex barely had time to react. One moment, she was a few feet away, her presence smoldering in the dark. The next, she was inches from him, her heat enveloping him like a flame. You want to see me? She whispered, her voice silken and dark. You wouldn't survive it. Try me, Alex replied, his voice a rough whisper. Scarlet's gaze dropped to his lips just for a moment before snapping back to his eyes. Her breathing quickened, and Alex felt the shift in the air between them. It was like the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. You don't know what you're asking, Scarlet murmured. Alex's hand moved instinctively, reaching up to touch her face. She tensed at first, her body rigid, but she didn't pull away. His rough fingers brushed over the smooth curve of her jaw, the contrast between them stark human warmth against alien perfection. You don't scare me, Alex said softly, his voice filled with a confidence that unsettled her. Scarlet's lips parted slightly, her breath ghosting over his skin. For a moment, she looked as though she might pull back, vanish into the shadows the way she had before. But then something in her broke, and she let him in. Her hand shot out, claws retracting, as her palm pressed against his chest. Alex's breath hitched, his heart pounding beneath her touch. Her black eyes searched his face, his strength, his resolve looking for any sign of weakness. She found none. You're a fool, she whispered again, though her voice trembled ever so slightly. Maybe, Alex murmured, leaning just a little closer. But you haven't walked away yet. Scarlet's lips curled, the faintest hint of a smirk. You're playing a dangerous game, human, and you're not stopping me, he replied. The tension between them thickened, turning the air heavy and electric. Scarlet's hand lingered against his chest, her touch warmer than he would have expected. Alex could see it, the way her confidence faltered, the way her gaze softened, the way her breath hitched when he leaned closer. Why do you keep coming back? She asked suddenly, her voice a whisper. Because I know you're not the monster they say you are, Alex replied without hesitation. Scarlet flinched, her black eyes narrowing sharply. You know nothing about me. Then let me. It was too much, too close, too dangerous. Scarlet stepped back, breaking the moment like a shattered glass. Her eyes were wild now, her breaths uneven. "You should leave this place." "I'm not going anywhere," Alex said firmly, his voice steady. "Not until I know why you're pushing me away." Scarlet turned sharply, her white hair sweeping behind her like a blade of light. "You don't belong here, Alex." He blinked. It was the first time she'd said his name, and the sound of it on her lips sent an inexplicable thrill through him. "And yet," he called after her, "you haven't killed me." Scarlet froze mid-step. Her shoulders tensed, her head slightly turned toward him, though she didn't look back. "Why is that?" Alex pushed, stepping toward her. "Why haven't you done it?" Scarlet was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft that Alex barely heard it. "Because I don't want to." And then, without another word, she disappeared into the jungle once more. Alex stood there for a long time, his heart pounding as her words echoed in his mind. "Because I don't want to." Something was happening between them, something that neither of them could stop. Scarlet was no longer the untouchable beast, and Alex was no longer the fragile human. And deep down, Alex knew one thing with certainty. The jungle's stillness was unnerving, the silence too perfect, too unnatural. Alex crouched by the edge of a small stream, splashing cold water on his face, trying to shake off the heat that lingered on his skin. It wasn't just the alien jungle that suffocated him, it was her, Scarlet. Her presence haunted him like a ghost even when she wasn't there. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, those black, bottomless eyes, those scarlet lips that pulled him like a magnet. He could still feel the warmth of her touch, the crackling energy that surrounded her, and the way she looked at him last night before vanishing into the shadows. "She's under your skin," he thought bitterly, and yet he couldn't let her go. A sharp snap echoed from behind him. Alex froze, his instincts flaring. Slowly, he straightened, reaching for his knife. Before he could turn, the presence hit him like a wave. Hot, furious, dangerous. "Looking for me." Her voice sent a chill down his spine. Alex turned to face Scarlet, but this time she was different. Her graceful, predatory movements were sharper, harsher. Her black eyes burned with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, her tone edged with steel. "And yet here I am," Alex shot back, standing his ground. Scarlet moved like lightning, closing the distance between them in an instant. She grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, lifting him slightly off the ground as though he weighed nothing. Her strength was terrifying, but Alex's gaze remained steady, locked on hers. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Scarlet growled, her breath hot against his face. Her grip tightened, claws threatening to tear the fabric of his shirt. "I could kill you right now." Alex's lips curled into a faint smirk. "But you won't." Scarlet's black eyes narrowed dangerously. "You think you're untouchable?" "No," Alex said softly, his voice even. "But I know you, Scarlet. You won't kill me because you're afraid of what happens if you let me go." Her eyes widened slightly, just a flicker, but Alex caught it. A wave of heat rolled off her, and he could feel the tension radiating through her entire body. "Stop looking at me like that," she hissed, shoving him back hard enough to make him stumble. "Like you know me." "I do know you," Alex shot back, his voice rising with the same fire she exuded. "You're not just a warrior. You're not just a beast." Scarlet snarled, her claws flashing as she lunged toward him. "You don't know anything." Alex caught her wrists before she could strike. The two froze, their bodies inches apart, their breathing ragged and furious. Scarlet's strength was incredible, but Alex refused to let go, his grip firm yet careful. Her chest rose and fell, her breath ghosting over his lips, and in that moment, the space between them shrank to nothing. Her black eyes locked onto his, and the tension reached its breaking point. "I see you," Alex whispered, his voice a rough growl. "You don't scare me, Scarlet." Her lips parted, her expression flickering between fury and something else, something raw, something vulnerable. Before she could react, Alex closed the distance between them. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle, it was fierce, desperate and consuming. His lips pressed against hers, his hands releasing her wrists to slide down to her waist, pulling her against him. Scarlet's body tensed, every muscle rigid, as though preparing to fight. But then she melted. A quiet gasp escaped her lips, and she leaned into him. Her claws retracted, her hands sliding up his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt, as though holding on for dear life. The fire that had burned between them turned into something else entirely hot, undeniable and uncontrollable. Alex deepened the kiss, his heart pounding, as Scarlet responded with a hunger that matched his own. Her lips were soft, but commanding. Her movements hesitant, but growing bolder. He could feel her surrender, not in weakness, but in the strength of trust. Trust that she'd never given anyone before. When they finally broke apart, Scarlet staggered back, her breathing ragged, her black eyes wide with shock. She raised a trembling hand to her lips, as though she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Alex's gaze remained on her, his chest heaving as he watched her unravel. Why did you do that?" Scarlet whispered, her voice unsteady. "Because you needed it," Alex replied, his voice low and rough. "And so did I." Scarlet turned away, her body trembling, her hands curled into fists at her sides. "You're an idiot, Alex. You're playing with fire." "Then let it burn," Alex said firmly, taking a step toward her. "Don't," Scarlet snapped, spinning to face him. But her voice cracked. The black eyes that had once been so hard now shimmered with something foreign, something uncertain. "I don't understand you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then stop fighting me," Alex replied softly. "Stop fighting yourself." Scarlet stared at him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, her shoulders slumped, the fight leaving her like a breath of wind. "You don't know what you're asking," she murmured. "Then show me," Alex challenged, his voice calm but steady. Scarlet's gaze lingered on him, her lips parting as though to speak, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned away, disappearing into the shadows once more, but this time, it wasn't with the same cold finality. Alex watched her go, his pulse still racing from the kiss that had ignited something far deeper than he could understand. He knew this wasn't over. Scarlet had let him in just barely, but it was enough. And Alex wasn't going to stop until he broke through the walls she'd built around herself. Whatever it took. The jungle was alive again, but this time it felt different. The sounds of strange creatures and the hum of glowing flora had taken on a rhythm that mirrored the pounding of Alex's heart. The kiss lingered in his mind, burned into his very skin. Scarlet's reaction had been everything he expected and nothing he could prepare for. Her fury, her hesitation, and that moment, she softened against him. It was a chink in her armor that he couldn't forget. Now, Alex was following a path she'd left behind, faint but purposeful. Maybe she wanted him to follow. Maybe she didn't. Either way, he wasn't letting her go. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the jungle became more hostile. Thick vines slithered down from branches like serpents. The temperature dropped, mist curling over the ground in unnatural swirls. "Scarlet," Alex muttered under his breath. He knew this was her doing her world, bending to her will, testing him. And then, as though summoned, she appeared. Scarlet stepped out from behind a twisted tree, her posture rigid, her expression carved from stone. The soft glow of the jungle reflected on her flawless blue skin, making her look even more otherworldly, even more untouchable. Her black eyes pinned him in place. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice low, dangerous. Alex straightened, unfazed by the deadly calm in her tone. "You didn't make it easy, but here I am." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're a fool, Alex. This isn't a game." "I know it's not," he replied, stepping closer. Scarlet didn't move, but the air between them crackled. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her sharp claws just barely visible. She was trembling, though whether from anger or something else, Alex couldn't tell. "I told you to stay away," she hissed, her voice rising. "You don't belong here. I am not someone you can..." "Can what?" Alex interrupted, his tone steady. "Care about, fight for, trust?" Scarlet's eyes flared, her claws shooting out as her control slipped. "You don't know me," she shouted. "You don't know what I've done, the blood on my hands." "I don't care," Alex's voice thundered back, surprising even himself. "You're not the monster you think you are, Scarlet. I see it every time you look at me." Scarlet's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling as she stared at him, stunned into silence. The mist swirled around her feet, and for a moment, she looked almost fragile, a warrior on the verge of collapse. "I don't need saving," she whispered, though her voice cracked. Alex stepped closer, slowly, as though approaching a wild animal. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you have to keep running." Scarlet turned her head away, as though trying to hide the storm in her eyes. "You don't understand what I am." "I understand more than you think," Alex replied softly. He reached out, his fingertips brushing against her arm. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "You're not a weapon, Scarlet. You're not just someone's legend." She turned to face him then, her black eyes shimmering with conflict, anger, fear, and something far deeper. "Why do you keep doing this?" she whispered. "Why do you care?" Alex's jaw tightened. He stepped closer until they were nearly touching, his voice low and steady. Because you need someone to care, even if you won't admit it. Scarlett's breath trembled. Her body was tense, as though caught between the need to fight and the desire to surrender. You're insufferable, she muttered, but the venom in her voice had softened. Alex smirked faintly. And yet, you're still here. Something inside Scarlett snapped. Before Alex could process it, she shoved him hard, sending him stumbling back against a tree. She closed the distance in a heartbeat, pinning him in place with her body. Her hands slammed against the bark on either side of his head, claws digging into the wood. You don't get it, Scarlett growled, her face mere inches from his. I am dangerous. I could rip you apart in seconds. You're playing with fire. Then burn me, Alex replied, his voice rough and daring. Scarlett froze, her black eyes widening. The space between them was suffocating. Her heat rolled off her in waves, her breathing ragged as she stared at him. The anger on her face melted into something raw, something unspoken. You're impossible, she whispered. Only because you won't let yourself trust me, Alex murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. Scarlett's breathing faltered. The moment stretched out, heavy and electric, as though the very jungle had gone still to watch. And then she broke. Alex reached for her, his hands curling around her waist, pulling her against him. Scarlett didn't resist. Her body softened, molding against his, as their lips crashed together in a kiss that was all fire and fury. It wasn't tender, it was a battle. Her hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, as though trying to drown in him. His grip tightened on her, fingers pressing into her hips, holding her as though she might slip away. Scarlett kissed him, with a desperation Alex hadn't expected. It was as though every wall, every barrier she'd built around herself, shattered in his arms. He could feel the fire inside her, the storm she kept buried, and for the first time, she let him see it all. When they finally broke apart, Scarlett sagged slightly, her forehead resting against his. Her breaths were shallow, her body trembling. Alex held her steady, his hands gentle now, as they slid up to her back. Scarlett, he whispered, her name soft on his lips. She closed her eyes, her hands still tangled in his shirt. I hate you for this. Alex smiled faintly. You'll get over it. Scarlett let out a shaky breath, a sound that was almost a laugh, though it was tinged with something close to surrender. Slowly, she pulled back, her black eyes meeting his. You shouldn't have come here, she said quietly, though the edge in her voice was gone. And yet, you're glad I did, Alex replied, his tone confident but soft. Scarlett didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head away, though not before Alex saw the faintest glimmer of a smile on her lips. Come on, she said finally, her voice calm for the first time. We have a long way to go. To where? Alex asked, still holding her gaze. To wherever this takes us, Scarlett replied, and as she turned, leading him deeper into the jungle, Alex followed without hesitation. Because for the first time, Scarlett wasn't running away, and he wasn't about to let her go. The jungle had changed. The air felt heavier, more alive like it was watching them. The silver light of the twin moons filtered through the thick canopy, casting ethereal patterns across the moss-covered ground. Alex followed Scarlett, her figure cutting a striking silhouette as she led him through the undergrowth, silent and purposeful. It had been hours since their last encounter, since her kiss had left him breathless and shaken. But Scarlett had said little since then. She walked ahead with a quiet tension in her shoulders, as though fighting an invisible war with herself, and Alex couldn't take his eyes off her. Her every step was deliberate, graceful, yet wild. The red dress she wore now, dirtied from their trek, clung to her body in ways that made it impossible not to notice the way her hips moved, the way her shoulders swayed ever so slightly. It was maddening. She stopped suddenly. We're here, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Alex blinked, pulling his gaze away from her figure to take in their surroundings. They had emerged into a clearing, a hidden oasis in the heart of the jungle. A small waterfall cascaded into a crystalline pool, its surface shimmering under the light of the moons. Soft, glowing flowers dotted the ground, their light casting a soft glow on everything. It was beautiful. Scarlett turned to face him, her black eyes unreadable. You should rest. We're safe here, for now. Alex let out a small laugh, shaking his head. I'm not sure I even know what safe feels like anymore. Scarlett tilted her head slightly, her gaze lingering on him. You're still here. Why? Alex stepped closer, his voice soft but steady. Because I'm not giving up on you, Scarlett. Her jaw tightened, and she turned her gaze away, staring at the water. You don't know what you're saying. I do, Alex replied, closing the distance between them. He stood close enough to feel the heat radiating from her, close enough to see the faint rise and fall of her chest. You've been alone for so long you don't know how to let someone in. But I'm not going anywhere. Scarlett's eyes snapped back to his, her expression a mixture of anger, fear, and something deeper. You should go, she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. No, Alex said softly, reaching out to touch her arm. Scarlett flinched, her body tensing under his touch, but she didn't pull away. Alex's fingers traced a gentle line along her smooth blue skin, a soft caress that seemed to unravel something within her. You're dangerous, Alex, she murmured, though her voice trembled slightly. Not as dangerous as you, he replied, his voice dropping lower. Scarlett let out a shaky breath, her black eyes locking onto his. The tension between them hung heavy, electric, like a storm about to break. Slowly, Alex reached for her other arm, his hand sliding down to her waist as he pulled her closer. Scarlett's hands rose instinctively, claws curling against his chest, not to hurt him, but to test him to see if he would falter. But Alex stood firm, his gaze steady and unrelenting. You don't know what you're doing, Scarlett whispered, though her voice was barely audible. Yes, I do, Alex murmured, leaning closer. The space between them disappeared. Alex's forehead touched hers, their breaths mingling as the tension reached a breaking point. Scarlett's body trembled against his, her claws retracting as her hands slid up to his shoulders, clutching him as though he were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Alex? Her voice was a whisper, a plea, and it undid him. Alex's lips brushed against hers, not a kiss, but a test, a question. Scarlett froze, her body going rigid. But then slowly, she relaxed, her lips parting as though to give permission. Alex kissed her, then soft, slow, and deliberate. Scarlett melted into him, her body pressing against his as her hands tangled in his hair. The kiss deepened, not in desperation, but in a raw, unspoken need that neither of them could deny. Alex pulled her closer, his hands sliding up her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. Scarlett let out a soft sound, half sigh, half growl, her body surrendering to the moment, as though the walls she had built around herself had finally shattered. When they broke apart, both were breathless. Scarlett's face was inches from his, her black eyes wide, searching his. Her lips were swollen, her breath uneven. What are you doing to me? She whispered, her voice trembling. Alex smiled faintly, brushing a thumb along her jaw. Maybe I'm saving you from yourself. Scarlett closed her eyes, her head tilting slightly into his touch, as though savoring it. Or maybe you're dooming yourself, she murmured. I'll take the risk, Alex replied softly, his lips brushing her forehead. Scarlett opened her eyes, staring at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. For the first time, her gaze wasn't hard or guarded. It was vulnerable, real. You're insufferable, she said quietly, though her lips curled into the faintest of smiles. And you're impossible, Alex shot back, grinning. Scarlett let out a soft laugh, though it was laced with something bittersweet. She stepped back slightly, breaking the moment but not the connection. Her black eyes lingered on his, her expression softer than he had ever seen. Rest, Alex, she said finally, her voice gentle. Tomorrow, you'll need your strength. For what? He asked, though he couldn't hide his smile. Scarlett's gaze darkened slightly, though the smirk on her lips remained. For whatever comes next. She turned, walking toward the edge of the pool, her movements graceful and deliberate. Alex watched her for a long moment, a quiet smile on his face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in days, he didn't care. Alex awoke to a sharp chill cutting through the clearing, the kind that raised the hair on the back of his neck. His instincts flared to life before his mind caught up. The jungle was too quiet. Scarlett was gone. He pushed himself up quickly, his muscles stiff but ready. The waterfall still murmured softly, the pool shimmering under the pale light of dawn, but the air carried something heavy and dangerous. Scarlett, he called out, his voice echoing faintly. Nothing. Alex cursed under his breath, grabbing his knife and slinging his empty rifle over his shoulder. She hadn't gone far, he knew it. Scarlett wasn't someone who left without reason. He stepped toward the dense foliage, eyes scanning for her tracks. But then he heard it. A snarl. The sound was inhuman, primal, a deep rumble that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. Alex turned sharply toward the sound, his grip tightening on his knife. Scarlett! Before he could take another step, she appeared. She emerged from the shadows like a storm-given form, her glowing blue skin marred with streaks of dirt and sweat. Her claws were unsheathed, her black eyes blazing with a fury Alex hadn't seen before. Her breathing was uneven, and the tension in her frame was almost tangible. "What happened?" Alex demanded, stepping toward her. "Stay back," Scarlet growled, her voice unsteady. Alex stopped short, his heart pounding. "What's going on? Talk to me." Scarlet staggered slightly, her hands curling into fists as she struggled to steady herself. The air around her seemed to ripple with energy, like the jungle itself was reacting to her anger. "They're coming," she said through gritted teeth, her voice rough. "The Zerathi hunters, my people. They're close." Alex's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, close?" Scarlet lifted her gaze to his, her expression hard, but laced with something else. Guilt, maybe. "They know I've been distracted. They want answers." "Distracted?" Alex repeated, his tone sharp. "Because of me?" Scarlet flinched, her claws flexing at her sides. "They think I've grown weak." "You're not weak, Scarlet," Alex said firmly, stepping closer despite her warning. "I am," Scarlet snapped, her voice cracking. "Because of you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. But before he could respond, Scarlet turned sharply, her hands rising to clutch at her temples. Her body trembled, as though struggling against something unseen. "Scarlet," Alex said softly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Look at me." "Go away, Alex," she growled. "You're only making this worse." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his tone unyielding. Scarlet spun to face him, her black eyes wild. "Why do you keep saying that? Why can't you just leave me alone?" "Because I care about you," Alex shouted, the words breaking free before he could stop them. "I'm not letting you fight this alone." The jungle fell silent. Scarlet stared at him, her expression frozen. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the words hanging in the air like a weapon ready to strike. Then, without warning, Scarlet crossed the distance between them. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice shaking. Alex didn't flinch as she grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him toward her with a force that sent his heart racing. Her claws grazed his skin, but there was no anger in her grip, only desperation. "Maybe I am," Alex replied, his voice softer now. "But you're not alone anymore." Scarlet's breathing slowed, the fire in her gaze flickering like a candle on the verge of going out. For a moment, she looked lost, the fierce warrior replaced by something raw and vulnerable. Alex lifted his hand, slowly, carefully, brushing his fingers against her cheek. Scarlet tensed but didn't pull away. Her black eyes searched his face, looking for something, anything that might break the storm raging inside her. "You don't have to fight this alone," Alex murmured. "Let me in." Scarlet closed her eyes, her face tilting slightly into his touch. "You don't know what you're asking for, Alex." "I don't care," he whispered. "I'll take whatever you can give me." Scarlet opened her eyes, and for the first time, Alex saw the tears shimmering there. She looked at him like he was the only person who had ever seen her for who she truly was. "You're insufferable," she muttered. "And you're impossible," Alex replied with a faint smile. Scarlet's lips parted slightly, as though to argue, but instead, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. Her hands slowly released their grip on his shirt, sliding up to rest against his chest, her claws retracting completely. Alex held her gently, his arms circling her as though trying to shield her from whatever pain she carried. "I'll protect you," he said softly, "no matter what comes." Scarlet let out a shaky breath, her voice barely audible. "I don't need protecting, Alex." "Yes, you do," he replied, "even if you don't realize it yet." For a long moment they stood there, surrounded by the silent jungle, the warmth of her body against his, the faint tremble in her hands. It was a moment of quiet in the chaos that surrounded them. Then Scarlet pulled back, her expression hardening once more. "We need to move," she said, her voice steady. "To where?" Alex asked. Scarlet turned toward the jungle, her gaze sharp. "To a place they won't follow, but you need to trust me." "I already do," Alex said simply. Scarlet glanced back at him, her black eyes softening ever so slightly. "You're a fool, Alex." "Maybe," he replied with a grin, "but I'm your fool." Scarlet didn't smile, but the corner of her lips twitched, and for now, that was enough. The night had fallen over Zerathis like a velvet shroud, the twin moons casting silvery light over the clearing. The jungle roared with life, but within its chaos, Alex and Scarlet moved in silence. Their bond had grown beyond words, something deeper, something primal. Scarlet led him into the shadow of a massive rock formation, hidden beneath vines that glowed faintly in the dark. Here, the sounds of the jungle dulled, replaced by the faint hum of water trickling over smooth stone. It felt like a sanctuary, a place untouched by war, danger, or death. Scarlet stopped, her figure illuminated by the moonlight. She turned to face Alex, her black eyes shimmering with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Her sharp edges, the ever-present fire in her stare, had softened just slightly. "Why are you still here?" Scarlet asked, though her voice lacked the bite it once held. "You could leave now. You could save yourself." Alex didn't hesitate. "I told you I'm not leaving you." Her gaze flickered, something fragile and conflicted passing through her expression. "You don't belong in my world, Alex. I'm not what you need." "You're everything I want," he replied firmly. Scarlet inhaled sharply, her claws flexing at her sides. "I don't know how to be what you want." Alex stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "You already are." Scarlet's breathing quickened, and for the first time, she didn't argue. The space between them seemed to close on its own, as though some invisible force was pulling them together. Alex reached for her, his hands resting gently on her waist, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. She didn't pull away. Her black eyes searched his, trying to find fault, to find hesitation, but there was none. Slowly, Scarlet's hands lifted to rest on his chest, her claws retracting completely. It was the first time she had touched him, without hesitation, without a hint of resistance. "You make me weak," she whispered. "No," Alex said softly, his voice a low murmur. "I make you whole." Scarlet's lips parted, a tremble running through her body, but before she could speak, Alex leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was slow, deliberate, filled with a tenderness that Alex knew Scarlet wasn't used to. She tensed at first, her body caught between fight and surrender, but then she melted against him. Her arms slid up around his neck, pulling him closer, as though afraid he would disappear. Alex deepened the kiss, his hands tracing slow lines along her back, feeling the tension in her body unravel with every touch. Scarlet responded with a hunger that matched his own, her lips parting under his, as a soft sound escaped her half sigh, half growl. Her fire was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was no longer sharp or dangerous. It was something warmer now, something that set Alex's entire body alight. He pulled her closer, her body molding against his, as though they were two pieces of the same whole. Scarlet broke the kiss, just long enough to meet his gaze, her black eyes shimmering with vulnerability and longing. "You're a fool," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you're impossible," Alex murmured, brushing his lips against hers once more. Scarlet let out a soft laugh, quiet, broken, but real. For a woman who had been forged in battle, who had spent her life as a weapon, this moment was something she had never allowed herself. But here, with Alex, she surrendered not in weakness, but in trust. Alex's hands moved up to cradle her face, his thumb brushing along her jaw. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Scarlet closed her eyes, a tear slipping free as her lips trembled against his. "What if I lose you?" "You won't," Alex promised softly. "Not now, not ever." Scarlet opened her eyes, and for the first time, they weren't the hard, guarded eyes of a warrior. They were soft, filled with something Alex could only describe as love. Without another word, Scarlet kissed him again. It was different this time, slower, deeper, filled with a desperation that came from years of solitude and silence. She clung to him as though he were her lifeline, and Alex held her with the same unyielding devotion. They sank into each other, the lines between them blurring until there was no longer a human and an alien, only two souls who had found each other in the unlikeliest of places. The jungle outside roared with life, but here, beneath the shelter of stone and starlight, they were untouchable. The world that had tried so hard to tear them apart no longer mattered. They were bound now, not by force, not by blood, but by something far stronger. Days had passed since that night, but everything had changed. Scarlet stood at the edge of a cliff, her white hair flowing like silk in the wind, as she gazed out over the endless jungle. Alex stood beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. "They'll come for us," Scarlet said quietly, though there was no fear in her voice. "Let them," Alex replied. Scarlet turned to look at him, a faint smile curling her lips. "You really are a fool, and you love me for it," Alex said with a grin. Scarlet rolled her eyes, but the softness in her expression betrayed her. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "I will protect you, Alex," she said softly, her voice like a promise. "For as long as I live." Alex squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "And I'll protect you." Scarlett's black eyes shimmered in the light of the setting sun, her fierce beauty softened by the love she no longer tried to hide. "Forever," she whispered. Alex smiled, brushing a kiss against her knuckles. Forever. Together they stood on the edge of the world, two souls bound by fire, by passion, and by an unbreakable vow. The jungle roared below them, the stars shimmering above, but none of it mattered, because in each other they had found something worth fighting for, something worth holding on to, forever.